March 1945. The German army's Eastern Front has been pushed back to within only 60 miles of Berlin itself. The shattered stormtroopers are now reinforced by young boys in a last-ditch attempt to defend Hitler's crumbling Reich. As they prepared for the final defense of their homeland, the desperate German troops were joined by a bizarre unit of SS volunteers. On their sleeves, the British flag. On their collars, the 3 lions of England. They were British prisoners of war who joined the hated Waffen SS, wore its uniform, and went into battle for Hitler.
We went straight into the SS uniform, and we were supposed to be getting ready to go on the Russian front.
We have tracked down the only survivor of the 59 men who passed through Hitler's renegade British SS unit. They enjoyed the freedom of Germany while their comrades suffered in prison camps or died in battle. But back home in Britain, they brought shame on their families.
My father was a traitor. He had betrayed his country and he paid the price.
At the end of the war, they were rounded up by MI5 and most were prosecuted. But the official files on their shameful actions were classified and locked away for 50 years. Only now can the story of the Brits who fought for Hitler be revealed. The British unit that fought for Hitler was not originally a German idea. It was in fact the brainchild of an upper-class, Harrow-educated Englishman called John Amory. Not only was he English, he was in fact the son of a leading member of Churchill's wartime cabinet, Leopold Amory. Much to his father's embarrassment, John was a sexual psychopath and a devious fraudster. Even his best friends nicknamed him the Rat. Despite the fact that he was a quarter Jewish, Amory was a fanatical anti-Semite and a devout fascist. Living in France when it fell to the Germans in 1940, he made pro-Nazi, anti-British speeches to French audiences. But Amory wanted a bigger stage for his treachery. He moved to Berlin and offered his services to Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda supremo. Already working for Goebbels was a group of British Nazi sympathizers led by William Joyce, the notorious Lord Haw-Haw. He broadcast Nazi propaganda to Britain, boasting of Hitler's triumphs and calling on his countrymen to lay down their arms.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
Many of the files on World War II traitors like Lord Haw-Haw are held at the Public Record Office. Historian and ex-intelligence officer Adrian Weale has spent years studying them and has had privileged access to other secret material still held by MI5.
Throughout the 1930s and the period leading up to the war, there was a substantial fascist movement in Britain led by Oswald Mosley. And a smaller offshoot of that was a British Nazi party, in fact led by Lord Haw-Haw, William Joyce. Just before the war, Joyce and 1 or 2 other British Nazis did actually travel to Germany. They made the decision that if there was going to be a war between Britain and Germany, then the German side, the Nazi side, was the one that they wanted to be on. They were traitors. They were people who had abandoned their country in the hour of need. By any classical definition of treason, they were traitors.
One of those traitors in Berlin was the young James Clark. Just before the war, he went to Germany with his mother, a fervent believer in Hitler, and for 2 years he broadcast propaganda for the Nazis. Today, James Clark lives in a Derbyshire village. He never took up arms against Britain, and he regrets his youthful enthusiasm for Nazi Germany. But he doesn't deny that he betrayed his country under Hitler's seductive spell.
It was a very definite, conscious choice. It was, will I stand by Hitler? Will I stand by the Führer in this enormous crisis of history, etc., etc. It was love. Infatuation with the cause and the results. France, as a military power, eliminated a British army withdrawn entirely from the continent. This seemed to be the triumph to beat all triumphs.
With his family background, John Amory's defection was another triumph for the Nazis and their British sympathisers.
You heard that the son of one of Churchill's cabinet ministers has come over to our point of view.
If you wish to look at Germany in good faith,
Amory threw himself into the propaganda war, churning out racist pamphlets and broadcasting the Nazi point of view.
propaganda would wish you to believe. Extension of living space, yes.
But Amory's treachery didn't stop at pamphlets. As he looked out over the Channel to England, the country that was now his enemy, he hatched a plan for what he called the greatest propaganda idea ever. A force of British volunteers fighting under the Nazi flag. John Amory called his imaginary British Nazi force the Legion of St. George. He put his proposal to Hitler, who thought the idea brilliant. On the 28th of December 1942, the Führer issued an order for the establishment of an English legion of fascist sympathisers. Quality, he demanded, not quantity. With the green light from Hitler, Amory rushed off to recruit British prisoners of war for his Nazi legion. But his first attempt ended in disaster. He was chased out of the camp by the angry British inmates. The Germans were furious at Amory's dismal failure, so they handed the project to the Waffen SS. One of the most brutal and hated military forces in history was now to have a British unit marching with them under the Nazi swastika. The German plan for a British corps in the Waffen SS was not as unusual as it sounds. Despite their image as the elite of German military might, the SS was also an international force, recruiting Scandinavians, French, Bosnian Muslims, and 2,000 Indian troops as well. Now they were determined to add a British force to their ranks. At a high-level SS meeting in Berlin, the new unit was named the British Free Corps. Recruiting would start immediately among the thousands of British and Commonwealth POWs in the Stalags. But life for those prisoners was harsh and humiliating. They were hardly likely to join forces with an enemy that was treating them so badly. Richard Wilson was captured in a battle at Dunkirk, which wiped out most of his comrades. He endured 5 years of German captivity, in grim conditions and with poor food.
The first place we were at, we got 3 Polish biscuits a day. They were rather big biscuits, like double-sized dog biscuits. And we went from there to Fort 8, where for a few days there was nothing. And then when the food turned up, it was, well, I suppose a pig would think it wasn't too bad. It was bloody awful.
So how were the Germans to persuade such unlikely recruits to come over to their side? Their answer, a clever public relations exercise. In a suburb of Berlin called Genshagen, they set up a holiday camp especially for British POWs. They hoped that well-fed, well-treated prisoners would be much more easily persuaded to join the Nazi cause.
Well, this is the site of Special Detachment 999, just outside the village of Genshagen, which is one of the southern suburbs of Berlin. Now here, the Germans built a holiday camp for British prisoners of war. They laid out a football pitch, but they couldn't use that very often because they had to dig air raid trenches in it. There was a camp theatre, there was a cafe where they could buy Red Cross goods and stuff imported from Switzerland. So it was much more comfortable than the conditions that they were used to.
And there were other treats too. These smiling prisoners enjoyed free beer, trips out to Berlin. They even had their own concert band. It was all designed to make them better disposed to Germany. But many prisoners were extremely suspicious of such temptations.
The rumour went round, or the Germans quietly pushed it around, that, you poor chaps have been prisoners of war, it must have been hard. Why not have a little bit more comfort and come to Berlin and we'll look after you, theatres and this and that and grub and loose women, all that sort of stuff. It doesn't matter what anybody's relations with the Germans were, anybody else's. I was on the other side.
Richard Wilson's suspicions were well-founded. Right from the start, the Germans had secretly planted in the Genshagen holiday camp a group of British Nazi sympathisers, stool pigeons, whose job was to persuade their own countrymen to change sides. Running the camp for the Germans was Quartermaster Sergeant John Brown. Chosen for his known fascist sympathies, he seemed to be an active collaborator. He used his position to set up a black market operation in Red Cross food parcels. Another member of the secret recruiting team was Frank Wood, real name Francis McClardy, a Liverpudlian fascist. He volunteered for the SS off his own bat. But the most sinister stool pigeon was a Londoner, Thomas Cooper. He'd already fought for Hitler on the Eastern Front and was the only British subject to receive a German war medal as a serving Nazi soldier.
He'd been a concentration camp guard, he'd been a member of Hitler's bodyguard unit, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and a very, very sinister, unpleasant character. Once they'd identified a potential recruit, then they'd take him to one side. They'd show him posters, they'd show him pamphlets, pictures of supposed British SS soldiers fighting against the Russians. And this was all designed to make a prisoner think that he was joining a big, successful movement.
One prisoner the recruiters especially targeted was physical fitness instructor Eric Pleasance. A former British fascist, Pleasance died in 1997, but he recorded this video after suffering a stroke.
And he told us that we're only going to fight communism and that kind of thing, and we would not have been asked to fight any Englishman or any other thing except the Eastern Front.
The prisoners were being urged to join a European crusade against Russian communism led by Germany. But as well as the glowing propaganda picture, the prisoners also saw the brutal reality of the Nazi regime.
Right next door to the holiday camp, where British prisoners are enjoying themselves, drinking beer, eating a lot of food, we've got the site of the Grossbeeren slave labour camp, where political prisoners, Jews and anti-fascists were literally worked to death by the Germans. and this was in full view of the British prisoners. There was no question that they were trying to hide it or anything like that. So on the one hand, you saw the Germans attempting to show how civilized they were, and right next door to it you have, you know, the classic symbol of Nazi barbarity, the concentration camp.
At the Grossbieren concentration camp, slave labourers from Russia and occupied Europe were worked to death or murdered. Their mass grave is now a memorial to Nazi brutality. But as well as siting their holiday camp next door to a slave labour centre, the Nazis had made an even bigger mistake. John Brown, the man they'd chosen as their chief stool pigeon, was all the time a double agent. Although he'd been a leading fascist before the war, he was also a committed patriot, working for British intelligence. He sent coded messages back to MI5 with full details of the German plans for a British SS unit. And he successfully sabotaged their recruiting efforts.
The crass flaw in the Germans' planning was that the man that they thought was working for them was working for the other side.
Furious at the failure of the holiday camp, the Germans now tried a more direct approach.
Having tried the carrot, holidays at Genshagen, for POWs who were cooperative, now it was time for the stick. They were stripped of all their clothing, they weren't fed properly, they were given very little water, they were kept in cold cells, they were shouted at. The choice that they were offered was more of this treatment. This is what the rest of your captivity is going to be like, naked on bread and water in a cell. Or join the British Free Corps, fight the Russians, be treated as a decent, honourable soldier.
The duty of prisoners of war was to resist interrogation, and most, like Richard Wilson, did.
A pistol by its barrel swishing past your nose and round your head, and a pistol held by the hand, sort of in your ear nearly, and that sort of stuff. They were doing that the whole time. If a bloke was in trouble and they thought he would bend, they bent him.
But the first person the Germans targeted, a captured commando called John Eric Wilson, broke after 3 days of ill treatment. Historian Adrian Weale has now tracked down the only living relative of John Eric Wilson.
Hi, David. David Greenhoff. Hi.
David Greenhoff was abandoned by his father before the war and adopted.
Well,
He only recently learnt of his father's identity and heard of his wartime experiences.
shall we?
David understands why his father gave in.
He didn't just sort of knock on the recruiting officer's door and say, "Hey, I've had a good idea, I'd like to join the British Free Corps." No. They took him in a cell, took away all his clothes, as I understand it, gave him a blanket and sort of left him there, kept him on starvation rations for several days, and during this time somebody would pop in and out and sort of say, how are you getting on then? Well, it's going to be like this for a long time, although there is an alternative. You could join this new group we're setting up. Well, you see, I suppose at least anyone would at least listen, wouldn't they? Lots of people listened. All right, some people found that unacceptable. I'd sooner starve and die for my country than join such things. But he was a young man, a bit wild, a bit adventurous, and all right then, I'll give it a try, I'll see what you mean.
And if brutality failed, then blackmail was tried. Prostitutes were used as bait in a classic honey trap.
It was illegal under the German military code for prisoners of war to have sexual relationships with German women, and theoretically at least the sentence for that could be death.
Once again, the Germans used British informers and stool pigeons to help blackmail their comrades.
What these British POWs, the informers, were doing there was despicable. They were helping in the mistreatment of their fellow British Commonwealth soldiers, many of whom were frightened, often slightly wounded. They've been brought straight from the front, and they're confronted by a certain amount of violence, a lot of psychological violence, and it's being aided and abetted by this small group of British POWs who are basically doing it for, you know, an extra bottle of beer and a chance to get a shag with a local prostitute.
But brutality and blackmail succeeded. The Germans had now press-ganged 25 British volunteers. It was the beginning, they thought, of a large and powerful force. The next step was to choose a commander. That man was German SS captain Hans Werner Röpke. Recently returned from the Eastern Front, Röpke was specially chosen because he spoke fluent English and admired British culture. Today, Hans Röpke lives in retirement on the outskirts of Frankfurt. Back in 1945, all members of the SS were declared war criminals. For 60 years, Röpke has refused to speak about how he commanded a British SS unit. So this first ever interview had to be recorded secretly.
They came to me and said there's going to be a meeting and they are going to recruit people for the British Free Corps. And this one chap said, well, you've always been so pro-American and pro-English and this and that and the other. And you're just a guy, you have to come with us. And I said, it sounds funny.
Despite Röpke's doubts, his superiors in the SS were determined to press ahead. Full of confidence that the British Free Corps would be a major force, they set up a headquarters and barracks here, in the town of Hildesheim, near Hanover, the heartland of Nazi Germany. During the war, its population were fervent Nazis, driving out the town's Jews and welcoming Hitler himself, who made several visits here. The Führer was as revered here as anywhere in Germany. Today, Hildesheim is famous for its St. Michaeli cloister. But in 1943, this medieval monastery was commandeered as a Waffen SS headquarters.
And this was the first headquarters of the British Free Corps. It's an old monastery, a seminary, where originally monks lived. But it was taken over by the SS in the early 1940s, and it was used as an instructional centre for SS recruits. The monks were removed, and these SS recruits moved into the barracks. It was when they arrived here in the spring of 1944 that the British Free Corps began to take on its military character.
They received their SS uniforms. On the collar, the 3 lions of England. On the sleeve, beneath the Nazi swastika, the Union flag of Great Britain and the honorific SS cuff title, British Free Corps, in English. 800 uniforms were ordered, and the first 25 recruits held their inaugural parade on April the 20th, 1944, Hitler's birthday. The British Free Corps was now a fully fledged unit of the Nazi war machine. The British Free Corps of the Waffen SS officially came into existence on Hitler's birthday, 1944. The British traitors were now fully paid-up members of the German army.
At this stage, they're issued with identity documents, and almost uniquely, one of these has survived. Here it is. It's an SS paybook, which also acts as the personal identity card. And it's issued to Francis McClarty, the Liverpudlian fascist. Here's a photograph of him with the Nazi stamps, and his signature, Frank Wood. Now, all of the British Free Corps were asked to sign on in the unit under false names, to protect their identities and to reassure them about what was going to happen at the end of the war. On the next page, we see, after the portrait of the Führer, that his rank is given as SS Unterscharführer, which is corporal. Here's his name again, Frank Wood. It's got the number of his identity discs, his blood group, the size of his gas mask, and the fact that he's a Germanic volunteer. The next page gives his personal details. He's born on the 17th of November 1915 in Lancashire, England. His religion is given as Gottgläubig, which is believer in God, the official Nazi religion. And this shows how committed he was to the fascist cause.
Unterscharführer, or Corporal Frank Wood, was put in charge of propaganda. Dedicated Nazi Thomas Cooper became a sergeant and taught the British traitors to give the Nazi salute. The men under their command were proud of their new uniforms and happily posed for the local photographer. Traditional British drill was allowed by Captain Rupke.
You remember Wilson, sending attention.
But David Greenhoff detests the uniform his father wore.
That's a very potent piece of sort of living history, really, as far as I'm concerned. British, free, Union Jack, but when you see it in juxtaposition to that symbol, and you know what that symbol meant, that worries me.
David Greenhoff fears that his father may have committed atrocities serving under the Nazi flag.
I hope and pray that it is so, that they were never involved or never invited to be involved in the acts of terror, the acts of unwanton wickedness that were perpetuated by some people in German uniforms.
But far from committing atrocities, most of the British Free Corps members were simply taking the Nazis for a ride.
John and I received the uniform made to measure, and we done the training, the machine guns and the rifles and that kind of thing, but only to keep out of the way.
Most of them, I think, were in the Free Corps to avoid having to fight at all, to get out of the POW camps, obviously, because it was an unpleasant existence for them, but they had no real intention of going to fight if they could avoid it.
There we were, and we were supposed to be getting ready to go on the Russian front. But at the time I began to think, I don't really want to go any front at all now.
Eric's commander, Captain Rupke, shared his men's reluctance to go into battle.
We were trying to kill time, And I made no move to send them up to the front, and they made no particular, they didn't show any particular desire.
Going to the front was the last thing on the mind of the British Free Corps men. Instead, they made the most of their freedom in the town of Hildesheim, much to the astonishment of local German people. One young boy who saw them, Joachim Dammann, has never forgotten his surprise.
One day, I saw these SS men, but they had the Union Jack up here on their sleeves, and they were speaking English. We were very surprised, because we were supposed to be at war with them. Another time, we were sitting in the barber's, and these two men came in, and they were talking in English as well. We looked at each other, and we thought, what's going on? The barber must have worked in England, and he wanted to call the police. He wanted to call the Gestapo, because he thought they were spies.
With most of their men away at the Eastern Front, the women of Hildesheim welcomed the new arrivals. The height of fashion for Hildesheim girls was a British SS boyfriend. And the place to be was the Café Corso, where the British Free Corps men spent their evenings. One romance that blossomed there is still a vivid memory for Elfriede Kuntje. For 58 years she's kept in her heart the secret of a love affair that crossed the bloody battle lines of World War II. Aged just 18, she fell in love with a British Free Corps soldier.
He came up to my table and he said, "Good evening, Fräulein." And then after that he came to my flat every night. He was tall, handsome, charming and courteous. A real English gentleman. We were in love, really in love, inseparable.
Elfriede knew her lover as Robert Kingsley, but his real name was Hugh Wilson Cowie, a private from the Gordon Highlanders captured in France and blackmailed into joining the British Free Corps. We showed Elfriede a British Free Corps uniform, like the one her lover used to wear.
Robert hatte nur hier noch, hatte noch ein Zeichen. Die britischen Löwen. The British Lions. Dass ich das noch mal wieder sehe. I never thought I would see this again. Sowas geht doch nicht weg. It never goes away. Sonst hätte ich mir ja nicht das Bild so. Why else would I have kept his photograph all these years? Wie ich in England war, das ist. I went to England 3 years ago, and while I was there, I thought about him a lot. Ich habe öfter an ihn gedacht.
Sadly, we had to tell Elfriede that Robert was dead.
Wenn das geht, if it's possible, I'll go over to England. 75. Dann kann ich sein Grab vielleicht finden. And maybe I can find his grave. Oh, weia. Oh God.
The 25 members of the British Free Corps in Hildesheim were sent off to attract new members from POW camps. But not all of them were keen to help the recruiting drive.
What we did was travel about Germany, trying to get other people to join the Free Corps. But we did that, but we didn't even try to do anything. We just travelled and travelled and visited people, and naturally we palled up with young ladies and that kind of thing.
Even when they did deliver their recruiting leaflets, most prisoners of war treated them with utter contempt.
They're regarded a bit like comic cuts, I think. Come and join us and fight Bolshevism. You know, not the Russians, Bolshevism. The people who delivered them were so unpopular, they came round before Reveille in the morning and with a parcel still tied up, 20 leaflets, still in there, chucked it in the door and bolted. People just picked them up and chucked them away. Put them on the fire if we had a fire, if we didn't, made a fire of them.
However, some POWs, like Yorkshire-born Robert Chipchase, did take the bait. The sole surviving member of the British Free Corps, he now lives in Kalamunda, near Perth in Australia. Today, he says he never joined the British Free Corps, but he didn't deny he was involved when we secretly filmed him.
I certainly was there, yes, and that's how I'm not denying it. Did you know it was called the British Free Corps? Did they call it that?
Oh yes, of course I did. I knew it was, and I British Free Corps, and I thought, pretty well, this would be interesting. What's it about?
You went to someplace Hildesheim.
Hildesheim?
Yeah, a monastery.
No. But I'm not going to say any more. I don't wish to talk about it.
And so you never put on German uniform?
I don't wish to talk about it any further.
Well, that's not true, and in fact, in the files here is an extract from his statement describing the few days that he spent at Hildesheim, describing the fact that he put on the uniform, describing the fact that he took money from them.
I was in the prison camp there, and I was on my own, and I just came along, and I thought, well, I thought I was going to go and do something, British Free Corps, and fight for the British Free Corps, for doing something behind the lines and joining something unit there, which these people, whoever they were, Germans, the two young people came, not in uniform. But I mean, I don't wish to go into all these details.
One detail Robert Chipchase did remember was meeting Thomas Cooper.
He's an Englishman. We could speak German very well, and he loved it. He loved to tell me all about people in the SS and how he was in the, what's the name, death camps, and going there and helping them to work there. He was a very hard, tough, bitter sort of a person.
After D-Day in 1944, there were few new recruits like Chipchase. SS headquarters was dissatisfied.
I do remember that he came up one day and he said, well, if this doesn't go on and no volunteers, we'll have to do conscription. And I just, well, I wasn't amused at all.
Mm. Well, it wouldn't have worked.
I said, that's silly. You're a defeatist, you know. And that was about the point my friend Riedweg sort of said, you better move on somewhere else.
At this stage, there was a rethink in the SS headquarters about what was happening. Blame for the lack of recruits, rather ridiculously, was placed on Captain Röpke. He was fired and sent off to join the SS Special Forces. And instead, the idea is now they're going to move the British Free Corps to Dresden, to the Pioneer Training Centre, where they'll train them as assault pioneers and just use them as combat soldiers.
At Dresden, the British Free Corps were trained to use explosives and flamethrowers. But some of the Germans training alongside them were more used to fighting the British. SS officer Werner Zolter arrived at Dresden from fighting against the 8th Army in Italy.
Im Oktober 1944.
In October 1944, after I'd been fighting on the front in Italy, I came to Dresden and was stationed in the pioneer barracks of the Waffen SS. To my amazement, I found there were several SS men there who only spoke English. We saw how they drilled with the English orders and typical English marching. Legs up high and all that. That's when we knew that there must really be English. We found out afterwards that there were men of the British Free Corps.
In January 1945, the British Free Corps reached its peak strength. A total of 27 men recruited from 150,000 British and Commonwealth prisoners of war. But while stationed in Dresden, the turncoats saw with their own eyes the way the war was going for Germany.
We were 20 miles away when we heard bombers. 3 raids were made on Dresden, and we were asked to go and help with the cleaning up. Hiroshima was nothing on the bombing of Dresden.
About a week after the firestorm, the British Free Corps were arrested en masse. There was some suggestion that they might be spies or agents. They weren't, but it was suggested that they might be. They were thrown in chokey, and that was the end of their period in Dresden.
March 1945. As the British Free Corps travelled from Dresden to the Eastern Front, they saw the shattered cities and exhausted soldiers of the defeated Third Reich. Even the die-hard Nazis in the unit now realized that they'd chosen the wrong side. The British Free Corps' last stand took place here, outside the village of Krusov on the River Oder.
Now here we're standing just about 2 kilometres to the west of the River Oder, and the Russians built up an enormous strength just on the other side of the river. Something like 2 million men were poised ready to descend on Berlin with thousands of tanks. By now, the Germans were completely desperate for troops. Their armies were shattered. They were conscripting 14-year-old boys from the Hitler Youth, giving them quick training in using a rifle, sending them into combat. They were getting old men, they were amputees, and right at the bottom of the barrel is the British Free Corps.
The beleaguered men of the 3rd Germanic Panzer Corps were shocked to discover that their desperately needed reinforcements were British.
They were right up forward, about as far forward as German troops were, observing the Russians on the other side of the river there, and the British Free Corps guys did say we could see the Russians, we could see them, you know, preparing positions, doing all the rest. They were under mortar fire for the first 10 days, so they were certainly under fire.
After a month on the front line, the British Free Corps were sent back to help evacuate the terrified civilians. It was a lucky escape.
When they did eventually attack, it was one of the biggest artillery barrages that's ever been witnessed in the history of the world.
The British Free Corps' German comrades were obliterated and the Russians swept into Berlin. The British traitors fled west and, ditching their Nazi uniforms, mingled with Allied prisoners of war who were now being liberated.
Most of them had kept British POW uniforms, which they had tucked in the bottom of their rucksacks, and they whipped these out and put them on, and they were passing themselves off as being normal British prisoners who'd escaped west.
But for the guilty renegades, the day of reckoning was at hand. A special MI5 squad interrogated the captured men and pieced together the whole story of the British SS unit. Some protested that they'd only joined it as an escape attempt. But others showed no remorse for their actions. A series of prosecutions and courts-martial followed. Thomas Cooper, who'd boasted to his comrades that he'd killed 80 Jewish women and children in a single day, was sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment. Frank Wood, who never gave up his Nazi beliefs, was given life. Most of the others received shorter prison sentences. But in Australia, where the thousands who gave their lives in World War II are commemorated, Robert Chipchase was never charged, and today receives a war pension from the government.
We were investigated naturally by the security, and we came out. And don't worry, we investigated.
And were you charged at all with aiding the enemy?
I don't wish to talk about it. No, never tried.
So
I'm sorry.
So you get your war pension now and everything.
No more. Oh yes, that's all. No more. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
This is not the original letter.
David Greenhoff's father, John Wilson, was sentenced to 10 years. He wrote from prison to David's mother.
I was in Germany. My intentions were still the same. I joined a corps called the British Free Corps. I suppose you'll know all about that now. I had a smashing time. You know me. He was obviously a bit of a lad. And the more I read about him, I thought, well, look at it this way. Here's an event in which millions of people died. Many of them not only in the battlefield, but in circumstances, disgusting and vile circumstances, tortured to death, starved to death, beaten to death. And here was a man who managed to spend most of the war swanning around Berlin, getting a grip of Norwegian maidens and having a wonderful time. I know it doesn't sound very moral, but to me he doesn't seem to have done very much harm either.
And the man who dreamed up the whole idea of a British Nazi legion, John Amory, faced the ultimate penalty. He laughed as he was found guilty of high treason, and on December the 19th, 1945, at Wandsworth Prison, he was executed. Amory's grand vision had proved a spectacular failure. Despite all their efforts, Hitler and the SS had fundamentally misunderstood the British character.
As I understand it, in the national characters, there's a lot of pig-headedness. Some people call it bloody ignorance, right? And some people say common decency. If I had joined the Free Corps, I would never come back here. I've been ashamed to.
We have to remember that there were something like 160,000 British soldiers held prisoner by the Germans, of whom maybe 100, 150 collaborated in an active way. So I think that does say a lot for the character of the British soldiers of the Second World War. That we were the ones with the integrity and the sort of honour to stand up against Nazism. And I think, generally speaking, that is an accurate picture of the British approach to fighting the Second World War. But nonetheless, there was a dark side. It should act as a kind of warning marker, a warning from history, if you like, that British people don't always act honourably.